You may recognize this murder's row of Christian apologists. We have, with his arms crossed there, we have Braxton Hunter. Between them, we have Jon McCray of What Do You Meme? I think that's his full name. It's John from What Do You Meme? We have Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy. And we have the other gentleman who hosted he's a pastor, and I've forgotten his name, and my apologies. Anyway, we have covered a bit of this video, but there was one particular section that I had forgotten that I wanted to cover, and it's been bugging me ever since. So let's see what they have to say about amputees.
Why doesn't God heal amputees or those with serious bodily defects like burnings, deformities, etc.?
I hope he does.
Okay, if you're in the religious sphere at all, you have heard potentially this question asked, either if you're a theist or you're not a theist. Why does God not heal amputees? In fact, I think there's even a website, something along the lines of why doesn't God heal amputees.com, something like that. And this question asker was also included like burn victims and other types of deformation type conditions which God could potentially heal. And the reason why this is an important question and why anyone would make this kind of distinction is because this is the kind of question that someone who is looking for evidence for God will ask. This isn't someone asking for a policy question from God, although that might be a reasonable answer. If someone came back with a reasonable answer and saying, God will do this category of miracle, but not this category of miracle, and there was a great theological reason, perhaps that would seem satisfying. But if you are searching for God, you will notice that when miracle claims come up, that they tend to be of the type that can't be externally verified. So they often tend to be healing of diseases or healing of conditions that are also known to completely take care of themselves. So for example, cancer has been known to spontaneously regress and sometimes even disappear. Mental illness conditions, drug addictions, finding your car keys, surviving a car crash, being at the right place at the right time to connect with a loved one or connect with an old friend, or finding an amount of money when you need that amount of money. These all tend to be the kind of miracles that are posited. The trouble is that we know that, or we assume that every single time those things happen, that it's not necessarily God, that we know these are things that happen without divine intervention, maybe not regularly, but at least some of the time. So it is incredibly difficult to rule out mere coincidence, or, that this is the kind of thing that, while occasionally happens, does happen and doesn't require divine explanation. What we do not have are medical examples of a limb spontaneously regenerating in a human, or burn scars spontaneously healing, for example. The reason why a secularist would like to have these kind of things pointed out is because that would at least cause us to say, well, that's not something that we can explain medically. That's not something that routinely happens medically. It's not something that routinely happens because of just pure happenstance. Car crashes don't always kill everyone. These are things that can be survived, for example. So when we ask, why doesn't God heal an amputee? It's because we're saying, why does not God perform a miracle that is clearly and less questioningly a miracle? But let's see what the crew wants to say about this answer to this theological question.
So the way I would say this is that we need to look at the big picture here. God doesn't heal 99% of people out there. Most people that have existed in history have not been healed by God. Jesus has been
a non sequitur. So we understand that miracles are going to be rare. That's not a problem for someone like me who's looking for evidence for God. If miracles happened, for example, I don't think that every time you find your car keys or your contact lens or your car in a parking lot, just because you prayed for that doesn't mean it was a miracle necessarily, right? So miracles can be rare, that's fine, and 99% of people never get a miracle, also fine. What we're wondering is, why aren't the 1% that are miracles ever something that's verifiable?
History was sort of like this big anomaly, and then there was some healings after that, but for the most part, this is just not what God is focusing on. Let's be clear about this.
Doesn't matter that that's not what God is focusing on. It's funny though, he's got an agenda. And he apparently, this omnipotent being needs to have a priority list going. He's got to be focused on something there. These secondary issues, too much for the omnipotent to deal with. But anyway, as we said, doesn't matter. We're still asking, why in the rare times when God does choose to do a miracle, why can't we verify it?
Jesus did heal an amputee. Remember when Peter took out the sword?
Right.
Jesus healed it. So
Malchus.
Yeah. This is theologically, it's an interesting question. So during Jesus's time on earth, allegedly he was willing to do things like feed the 5,000 or put someone's ear back on, do these kind of miracles that could be externally verified. Was there a whole lot of fish to feed people before? No, there wasn't. Okay, we can check that out. Now there's 12 baskets left. We can do some examination of evidence. Again, we're not asking for more miracles. We're not asking that we personally, selfishly, get a miracle ourselves. We're just asking for one that doesn't fall into the category of, well, that also just happens sometimes.
Yep.
He wasn't aiming for the year, though.
Yeah.
He just missed. So you're absolutely right. So he does, but let's remember that this is like part of a sub-question of a much larger group, is why isn't God doing more healing and stuff?
No, that's exactly not the point, Mike. 100% not the point. You missed it completely. This is not a subsection of a question as to why doesn't God do more miracles. This is entirely its own category of why doesn't God do verifiable miracles, no matter what the rate.
And I think we need to remember, what is God focusing on right now? Right now, he is focusing on making us more virtuous, getting us ready for eternity, sanctifying us.
Why is God focusing on that exactly? I mean, it's a bit of a non sequitur here. It's a bit of a rabbit trail, but why does God need to work on improving virtue when it's clear, at least in the teachings that I've received about heaven, and let me know in the comments if this matches what you've been taught about heaven, is there's no sin in heaven. There's no gnashing of teeth. There's no sadness. Like, it's not just our physical states that will be perfect. We've promised in 1 Corinthians 15 that we will get a resurrection body and that will be of good stuff. But in heaven, we're not going to sin. So what's the difference if I get into heaven like the thief on the cross, who didn't get any chance to have his virtue worked on, versus you, Michael Jones, who has had decades to have your virtue worked on? Will there be any discernible difference between you and the thief on the cross who entered heaven the next day? That's not the kind of heaven that I was taught. Now, heaven is vague and everyone's got their own interpretations of it, but it doesn't seem to make sense that God has a project of making us virtuous here on earth. That seems rather inconsistent.
Focus on making us perfectly happy. He's focused on trying to build our characters and our virtue. And there are different ways he's going to do that with different people, whether we like it or not. He's not here to be our butler in the sky, make everything happy, always heal us when we demand it. He says, in your weakness, my strength is made sufficient. That's what.
So I'm repeating myself over and over, but they are missing the point over and over. Again, don't care if miracles happen 1% of the time or 0.1% of the time, whatever tiny fraction of the time miracles happen. We're just asking if that tiny time when you come to us and tell us this is a miracle, why is it never something like an amputee being healed that can't be easily dismissed as something that regularly happens, or at least occasionally happens?
We're supposed to think through our weakness, he is made strong, and that's what he does. So he's going to work through people that are amputees or that are handicapped in some way. He's going to work with people without it. He's focused.
It's just, if you're an amputee, that's God's plan for you. Now, when I was a Christian, I totally would have agreed with that. If you were paralyzed, what was her name? Joni Erickson. Joni Erickson. I think that was her name, unless she was paralyzed, for example. That was just God's plan for her. And that's fine. But again, you're missing the point here in a way that seems rather insensitive and cruel from an outsider. I get why it makes sense to an insider.
Right now, his aim in my view, is to sanctify us. And then in the resurrection, then all of that will be wiped away, as Revelation says.
Paul says something almost exact.
Yeah, so exactly. So what is the point of sanctifying us here on earth as opposed to just transporting us to heaven where instantly that will happen? I always understood the mission of Christians who remain here on earth to be working to help save as many as possible. Not that this is our own personal self-improvement time, right? Self-improvement, sanctification does nothing if your neighbor is going to hell, but you are slightly more virtuous because of your time here. This is not a theology I'm familiar with. So if you want to elucidate me, let me know in the comments if this is the kind of theology that you currently or used to follow.
Exactly like that, and you were referencing it. Because he says, I've asked 3 times, I have this thorn in the flesh, messenger of.
Yeah, but hold on, no.
Well, I think that becomes.
Yeah, so Paul the Apostle, not me, thorn in the flesh that he was asking to be removed. Again, Braxton similarly misses the point. We're not asking why God doesn't do miracles on demand. Again, just why aren't they verifiable? And we don't know what Paul's thorn in the flesh was. So maybe he had something that would have been incredibly verifiable. Perhaps, he had scars or wounds or something that would have, had been healed, would have been very noticeable and unexplainable. Maybe. We don't know what Paul's thorn in the flesh was, or maybe it's an annoying person who was always following him around. We don't know. Speculation abounds.
It's an issue a lot of times because the assumption is wrong. Like, Christianity doesn't teach that you're always going to be happy and perfectly chilled and stuff in this life. You know what I mean? And so the assumption is wrong. But to be fair, a lot of people get.
No, the question asker wasn't assuming that miracles needed to happen at any rate. The question is asking, you're saying, why, given that it seems to be a non-zero rate? If it's at a non-zero rate, why at all? Why can't we verify any of them? So if Christians are willing to just stop claiming that anything is a miracle, good. All right, we'll just carry on and not expect any. That's fine.
That assumption because a lot of evangelists or some people will be teaching that, like, come to God and he'll do all these things for your life, so.
Yeah. Hey, remember what God is doing. He's trying to make our souls better. Bodies will be taken care of in the resurrection. Right now, this is what's important.
Okay. Wow. Bodies will be made better in the resurrection, so we need to improve our character here. That just seems weird. Every version of heaven that I've been told about, we will become sinless, we will be without character. We don't actually know exactly what's going to happen to our sin nature, if it's completely gone or just God is so glorious that we won't want to sin anymore. There's all kinds of ideas about that, but none of it says that the person who's modestly more virtuous here, Mike is a virtue ethicist. I don't know how you say it. Anyway, he believes in virtue ethics. If you're modestly more virtuous here because of some suffering you went through, is that any difference in heaven than a child who died before the age of accountability, or the thief on the cross, for example? That's a weird take on heaven. But more importantly, everyone on that panel completely missed the point of the question of why doesn't God heal amputees? So now that we've clarified that, this is a tip for secularists among us non-Christians who might ask this question. I guess we have to clarify up front more concisely what we mean. But Christians, given that we hear miracle claims all the time, why are none of those miracles that you're presenting something along the line of an amputee that we can verify and definitely be from God, as opposed to just happenstance?